Gloria in excelsis Deo.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Hidebound Convivium. It is January 1st, 2020. I want to go ahead and apologize for really the long delay in content. You see, after my Advent video went up, I had quite a bit of trouble with my school. As some of you may know, I changed majors. I ran into some issues in the teacher education program at the college that I attend. And long story short, I don't want to impugn people's motives or say things about people that aren't true. But I felt like I was mistreated in the whole affair. And long story short, I decided to take a different direction with my education. I'm still very much interested in education, and I'm hoping to eventually find a career there. But at the current time, I'm not sure how that's coming about. So it's actually going to make this video a little bit interesting, since the topic here is education and sort of a deep dive, a dissection of the modern secondary education system. One of the things that I've come to realize over the past few months of observing and teaching in the public system of education is how woefully inept the education system is at attempting to teach what it is they're attempting to teach. So, these functional literacy skills. Essentially, they're attempting to make students who are not functionally literate, so that they can at least make somewhat decent marks on these tests. And they're failing woefully, of course, in any sort of transmission of culture, which of course is why I was interested in education in the first place. Probably why I shouldn't have been interested in public education. Um, but regardless of that, I'm going to go ahead and dive into the meat of the essay. I've already read over it several times, and it's very long, and it gets into a lot of minutia. So if you're not one of these people who likes very detailed analyses of things, this will probably be a video to skip over. But without further ado, we'll be diving into this essay entitled Virtue and Education. As some of you may know, I was previously finishing up an undergraduate course in education at a public university. I'm no longer pursuing a career in that field for reasons that will be explained at other times and in other places. As part of my requirements, both for graduation and licensure, I spent a considerable amount of time teaching and observing in the public school system. Altogether, I've likely observed or taught for 3 or 4 months in the aforementioned education system. That's given me a sense of perspective about the problems that students and teachers in general face, but in particular, those who are of a more traditionalist dispensation or disposition like myself. It may profit us to pause for a moment and discuss why I wanted to teach in the first place. Even before I chose this profession, I was fully aware that the discipline, even in the deep red state in which I live, is disproportionately the haunt of social progressives. My own field, English, is in some sense the worst offender in this regard. Much of the battle over revisionist historiography in public education, for example, is centered not around history textbooks, which are admittedly contentious, but around the issue of English teachers smuggling it in through the sloppy and, in some cases, maliciously false historical characterizations of feminist literature. It then begs the question why I chose this discipline. I chose the discipline of English for the same reason that social subversives are drawn to it, and namely that literature and the study thereof is a powerful tool for the shaping of minds. Kipling may have said that prostitution was the oldest profession, but I answer that the oldest profession was surely that of a bard or a storyteller. There's nothing more central to the human experience than the sharing of stories, both the historically true and the fictional. This realization forms the marrow of my love for the profession of teaching English. That is, in sharing the stories of our society, past and present, with the next generation and instructing students in the means to read, understand, and, we dare to hope, carry the torch of Shakespeare and Eliot into the future. That is why it's with no small degree of sorrow, although I was not surprised that my experiences on the other side of the desk were not much different than those of my student days, that I report that the modern system of education is not conducive to any socially useful goal. There's a strange thing at work in the halls of education departments across the 50 states and in educator training programs similarly. That is, there is a dialectic at work in the minds of educators and regulators that amounts in its totality to the educational system tilting at windmills. What do I mean? Much of the educational theory and practice in the last 30 to 40 years has been in reaction to the so called factory model. Under the factory model, students were, in a hypothetical sense, if not an actual one, treated as units on an assembly line. Each grade and subject therein was analogous to a station on said assembly line, and as each student passed by, they would have some quanta of knowledge infused, so they might continue down to the next station where another quantity of some knowledge X was infused, until finally they came to rest as a finished product with some Y quantity of X knowledge at the end of the line. Leave aside the fact that we now consider it somewhat barbaric, the factory model had great social utility in its day. Preparing students for rote mechanical work was, at the very least, giving them some skills, and conditioning them to long hours of discomfort and toil was, at the very least, useful to them in their future work. The factory model was supposedly abandoned, not, I would argue, because it was ineffective or bad pedagogy, but because circumstances in the wider economy changed. Well, and to speak of something as bad pedagogy is to say that it did not accomplish the teaching of what it set out to teach. No one would accuse the mafia of bad pedagogy in the training of murderers and cutthroats. Such is the case with the factory model of education. Just because the outcome was bad doesn't mean the pedagogy was bad. This is at the core of my argument that theories of education only make sense insofar as they are explicitly directed at some end. At any rate, the factory model was abandoned in favor of whatever it is we have now. Consider this to be one of the greatest misnomers in education theory, the quote unquote abandonment of the factory model. The model itself, as an approach to pedagogy, never really died. What died was the economic conditions that gave rise to it. But new economic conditions arose. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, America shifted from an industrial economy to an information economy. Attendant with this change, America no longer needed docile, complacent factory workers, and it now required docile and complacent office workers, computer engineers, and so forth. The skills changed, the fundamental relationship of the education system and the government to the economy did not. During the era of the Cold War consolidation, the federal government seized the means of education in service of beating the Reds. And as we all know, once the federal government gets something in its clammy, ice-cold grip, nothing can pry it from its rigor-mortized hands. The new factory model, which characterizes itself as a, quote, skills-based, literacy-focused curricular system, I should add, college and career readiness system, has different goals. For one, they want to increase functional literacy, read analytical literacy. That is the art of deconstructing small bits of text and examining them from one lens or angle or another. The way this works in practice is somewhat schizophrenic, in my opinion. For example, in one class session, you might read one text to analyze characterization. In another, you might analyze author's purpose or narrative structure. Never mind that all fictional texts have characters and thus characterization, structure, purpose, and so forth. What the curriculum tends to do is single out test cases where some element desiring examination is particularly acute, which makes it easier to teach, but leaves students oftentimes with the impression that the elements common to all narrative writing or non-narrative writing are contained in isolated areas. The end result of the system of education is that students are essentially never taught how to read a story holistically. That is, when people take in a novel or a short story or a poem for pleasure, they read the whole thing and all the elements combined simultaneously to communicate what Edgar Allan Poe called the unity of effect. This unity is extremely important. Remember, unity is a transcendental, and it is extremely important to the meaning of a story. By neglecting it, you've cut out an enormous part of the study of literature. There are also skills focused in group work and interpersonal communication, and these amount to exercises in consensus building. Fundamentally, they misunderstand the dynamics of how every consensus in a group of people, whether a study group, a tribe, or a country, has ever formed. It is almost always the case that some influential member of the group, whether because of force of arms or their charismatic zeal, quickly takes charge and sets the agenda for the rest of the group. While in smaller groups, leaders are often highly conciliatory. It's nevertheless the case that all such groupings tend to a form of soft despotism. So much of the curricular focus is, in a roundabout way, how to disguise what we all know is the case under democratic sounding jargon and the teaching of students to be artificially nice in such situations. One of the more fatal flaws of the new regime that I will touch on before moving to more fruitful grounds is the reaction against rote memorization. There was and has always been a school of thought that eschewed rote memorization as something to be avoided, as almost an insult to human dignity and, most crucially, a waste of everyone's time. Such sentiments only increased in influence and volume with the popularization of the internet and its slow introduction into everyday life of the students both within and without the classroom. In subjects like mathematics, the utility of memory has been retained, if for no other reason than one cannot function effectively without it, save by the aid of increasingly complicated calculators, which are more and more appearing in classrooms for simpler and simpler mathematics classes. The best educators will tell you, however, the student cannot master even simple things, and here by master we mean evidence more than a moderate competency, without committing to long term memory certain basic facts and details which undergird the concept. The concept of memory, which the modern education system seems to have, is that human beings need to commit very few things to long term memory, while increasingly relying on tricks to broaden short term memory. While it is true that short term recall is an important part of education, almost all efficiency in both time and thought is lost when you have to stop every so often to review the basic facts and definitions or look them up because you've forgotten them. This is a large part of why many students, I think, are so frustrated, especially in disciplines like the study of literature, which induce a high cognitive load. Having to constantly have terms redefined and reviewed while attempting to learn concepts that are years and years in advance of that original point of knowledge introduces so much cognitive load that it is no wonder they find the process tedious and painful. So let's take a concrete example to illustrate my point. Let's say you want a high school senior, which in the United States corresponds to students aged 17 and 18, to understand the concept of contrapasso as it is used in Dante's Inferno. Most of you might think that high schoolers are not really competent to do this, but more on that anon. To understand the contrapasso, they must have a great deal of background knowledge. They must know, first of all, what irony is. Most students could not define irony to you, or what makes something ironic. And then there are all the different forms of irony. Then there is relation between such irony and, quote, poetic irony, or what we would call poetic justice. Then there is the concept of poetic justice itself. Then there is its application to Dante specifically, and how specific characters in Inferno demonstrate the concept. So that's a total of 5 logical steps, each requiring a great deal of explanation and extrapolation. Because of the de-emphasis on memory, most teachers have to begin at the first rung of the logical ladder every time they want to teach a new concept. In short, the lack of teaching from memory has made the process of education, especially in the discipline of English, akin to building a house starting at the roof and working your way down to the foundation. As we have said previously, the goal of secondary school and the end towards which it was ordered was previously toward the manufacture of human cogs for factory lines and menial office work. In the current era, the end towards which secondary school education is ordered is the university system. The current system, when followed through with the utmost rigor and applying the most talented pupils to the task, reaches apotheosis in the training of one type of individual, and that is the university professor. If one is not found to be of sufficient talent, latent intelligence, or rigorous adherence to the benchmarks of the education process, they may settle for a place as a human cog within the machine of corporate America, engaged in a process of either wringing more moisture from an increasingly dry sponge, as is the case in the development of new software, or, as one popular reactionary academic has put it, overseeing the copulation of ducats. This is why it is fundamentally dishonest, or at very least lacking in self awareness, when modern educational theorists decry the factory model and boast about its death and replacement. It's been replaced, but only in the most superficial way, by the college and career readiness model of today. It is still fundamentally an expression of the government's molding of human persons to economic ends. There have been, of course, other theories to emerge that challenge the contemporary theory in other ways. There is the small and loosely defined perennialist movement, which I am closely aligned to. Perennialism in education, in some sense, is a reskin of the classical model with a focus on transmission of cultural heritage. Much more influential is the theory of educational social activism, which states roughly that schools are places where young people can be militarized in favor of making improvements in the world. Read more objectively, social activism theory is merely progressive catechesis. Schools that do not practice this form of pedagogy are increasingly finding that new teachers will oblige to introduce activism into the curriculum, whether asked for it or not. Progressivism is the only religion I know that is allowed to evangelize to children in schools, which, of course, we should expect at this point. Both of these approaches and the dominant social utility approach purposefully avoid one thing, and that is serious talk of virtue. One might think the activists are speaking about virtue, but given the goals of progressivism are in some sense denatured from all objective realities, they are not being inculcated in virtue so much as how to stay within the current leftward movement of the cultural commissariat, how to appease those commissars, and how to become one yourself. This is the closest we come in schools to teaching students, implicitly at least, about the exercise of raw power. No, we no longer talk about the good as it pertains to human persons or anything else, really. This is a shame. For the teaching of science and mathematics, we might think is a kind of virtue in teaching what is useful. And in English, the teaching of grammar, of course, is the same sort of usefulness. But as we move forward into an increasingly uncertain future, where the value of human work decreases more and more by the day, it would seem that educating students to be useful first and foremost is a mistake. Now, I applaud the efforts of some educators to encourage students who show aptitude and interest to pursue careers in the trades, uh, despite the fact that these are in no sense automation proof. Nevertheless, it makes good sense for these students to pursue not only what is useful, but highly in demand. But this yet again reflects the disordering of our society. This is the ordering of all men to the whims of mammon. We are accustomed in modern times to think of work, nearly any kind of work, as a charity for the otherwise destitute, that is, all of us. Few, if any, of the students I have taught or observed in the 2 years of educator training have any assets whatsoever, familial or otherwise. This feeling of utter dependence on corporate taskmasters, sometimes as distant to us as an alien race, is overall corrosive to the human spirit. Work has been transformed, in other words, from an enterprise that is useful not only for supporting a family, but also to the polis itself, into a kind of dependence, taking on the character of a welfare payment. This attitude towards work is prevalent in my generation, the so-called Generation Z, but as automation and outsourcing continue to be stresses on the labor market, this attitude of work as dependence, what is often called wage slavery, will continue to grow. And that is why an emphasis on the usefulness of education should at this point be secondary to a focus on the cultivation of virtue. This is the key pivot that a responsible regime of education would make if it cared about producing fully formed human beings and not widgets with human faces. I am reluctant to say that this is perhaps an inevitable byproduct of a centralized, federally bureaucratized program of schooling. It may be that the foundations of a rebirth in virtue ethics and education may very well be in the homeschooling and classical school movements. In forthcoming videos, I will delineate what I think it means to educate a child in virtue. For now, I will leave the dissected corpse of the current education regime on the table, so to speak. This has been the Hidebound Convivium. Thank you for watching.